Author and professor Damon Fordham is presenting a collection of Black South Carolina stories and narratives based off of interviews and research. Today, I talk one-on-one with Damon about his latest book for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Damon Fordham, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Well, glad to be back. It's been a while.
You are obviously the author of 5 books, a public lecturer, a tour guide, storyteller, and of course the adjunct professor of history at the Citadel. Now you are out with another book called Black Folk Tales and Chronicles of South Carolina. And of course you present to the audience a collection of Black South Carolina stories and narratives based on interviews and research, including your travels recently to Africa. So tell me, Damon, why this book? Why now?
For several reasons. Number one, it used to be that before many of us had the opportunity to go to school and learn to read and write, when the masses of our people were kept purposely illiterate as a means of providing a permanent class of cheap labor, the way they taught and the way they educated and the way they entertained was through folklore. And when I went to Africa, I found that even though, of course, you have a lot of education in Africa, contrary to what a lot of people think, they still have that deep storytelling tradition. And I found the connections with that and what I saw growing up as a boy here in South Carolina. Now, I put special emphasis on the fact that when I said when I was a boy, because the storytelling tradition largely died out within Black America around the late 60s, early 70s, when you had television, as well as many people saying, man, I don't want to hear all that old slavery time talk and that sort of thing. So the generation who told those things died out, but young people like me listened. And so I think that they still have a lot to say to us. And I think it's important to keep those stories from forever being lost to the graveyard.
What stories need to be told right now when it comes to folklore and obviously that storytelling tradition?
Well, for one thing, I think we also need to understand that many people have this mistaken idea that our history is nothing but tragedy and oppression. And that is far from the truth. I mean, even before you had Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, you had many people who were of resistance. There were a number of stories in the book that deal with resistance, including that of not just the Denmark Vesey slave rebellion, but also others, and an uprising that took place here in Charleston in 1919 that very few people know about. I found this story from this gentleman who was interviewed in 1937 about the uprising in Charleston in 1919 that few people know about today. You see, my thing is this. Yeah. I believe in balance. You see, so many people want to concentrate on nothing but the tragedies of our history because they have this mistaken idea that that'll, quote, wake the people up. And others only want to deal with the triumphs because they feel that that's the only way to inspire people. And my thing is, you need a little bit of both. You need to know about the tragedies so that people can understand what to do in case such things happen again. And you need to know about the triumphs to understand that you can still move forward in spite of things. So that's why I decided to do it a very balanced view in this book.
What are the triumphs and what are the tragedies when it comes to this particular book, Damon?
Well, I just mentioned earlier, it talks a little bit about the slavery rebellions and such things. I also talk about people who, on the tragic side, there are a couple of accounts of race riots and lynchings and that sort of thing on one end. But on the other end, there are stories about people who overcame slavery to become teachers and doctors and professionals and such, as well as just ordinary everyday folks who used humor and wisdom through their stories as a means to how I got over, essentially, in the same way that you had back in the days of the spirituals.
Right. What was that tool that you used to actually tell this particular story, Damon? Was it the humor?
Sir?
Yes, sir. What was that tool that you used for this particular book? Was it humor?
Well, I use a wide variety of things. Now, for example, there was a story that was recorded from Maria Middleton down in Port Royal, South Carolina, around 1919 for a book called Folk Tales of the South Carolina Sea Islands, where she talks about how it was a story about Brer Rabbit, who was a major character in both African as well as African American folklore. And the story goes that he was sent to jail for stealing food from the other animals, and the animal judge sentenced Brer Rabbit to hang. And so the rabbit's in jail, feeling sorry for himself, when his friend the crane came to visit him. And the crane said, "Boy, Brer Rabbit, I sure feel sorry for you." And he said, "Well, wait a minute, I got an idea." And he called the crane down, he whispered in the crane's ear. And the next morning, they took Brer Rabbit out to the gallows, and the animals are out there going, "Hang Brer Rabbit! Hang Brer Rabbit! Hang Brer Rabbit!" And so they take him in the handcuffs and they put the noose around his neck. And all of a sudden, a voice comes from the clouds and goes, "That rabbit ain't done nothing. Let that rabbit go." And the other animals look up in the sky and went, "Ah!" and ran away. And so the crane flew down from the clouds after all the other animals ran away, untied Brer Rabbit, took the noose off his neck, and Brer Rabbit said, "Good job, Brother Crane." So the crane hid behind the clouds and pretended to be the voice of the Lord to save the rabbit's life. Now, the point of that story is that story was told in 1919 by a lady who was unlettered, born in slavery in Port Royal, South Carolina. And it showed that even with people who were unlettered, they used stories to cope with the kind of things they were dealing with at that time. And that's a great story to me of resilience.
Yes, indeed. What are the people, particularly, when it relates to this story, Damon, what are people dealing with right now? And what are they doing to cope with those situations?
Well, today it's really a hard thing to say as regard to right now, because a lot of people are really confused. There is no real leadership. There is no real direction at the moment. And one of the things that's absent in America in particular right now are voices of reason. You have these people on one end following the wrong man, and the other side doesn't know what to do because they were totally blindsided and caught off guard by that. So there's just a whole lot of confusion going on right now. And one of the things that I hope this book accomplishes is to show that people, even in times somewhat worse than this, were able to find clarity and to find their way by reaching into themselves and passing down these things from generation to generation, the wisdom that once got them over. Now, of course, times have changed and not everything from the past applies to now, but you could take some things that apply to now and use that for your benefit and move forward.
What things from the past that you use now, that you use in the book to apply to this book?
See, another part of the book, I
Oh,
deal
yes,
with
sir.
the actual stories of my actual ancestors as well as elderly people that I knew. My father, back in the 1940s, he was a student at South Carolina State as well as a soldier fighting in Saipan in World War II, and he wrote about his experiences. And every now and then, since he died in 1984, I keep that journal and I read that. It's almost like I'm having a conversation with my father, but I took the wisdom that he wrote in that book so long after he is dead to help me with today. Now, there are a lot of people out there right now who never knew what it was to have a wise father sit down and give them life lessons and experiences and that sort of thing, or something constructive. So I hope that in reading something like that, as well as some of the things from some of the other elders of my youth, those who have never had that experience in person can draw something from that to help them now.
And speaking of now, Damon, what have you learned more about folklore after writing this particular book?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me that. You see, a lot of this folklore was buried in archives for many years because, for one thing, a lot of them were written in dialect that most people have a hard time reading today. So I translated it into readable English. But the thing that I learned most was how these things connect to Africa, because in Africa, you have the griots, who were the oral storytellers who passed down stories for hundreds of years. Okay. Some stories they tell are over 1,000 years old, whereas most African Americans don't know their history past 2 and 3 generations because of slavery and the disconnect that that caused, right? And I found the connection between so many of the stories that I heard as a boy and the stories that I heard recently when I went to Africa. And I make that connection within the book to let people know that there's more to our history than slavery and misery and all these other sort of things. They're constructive things from that they use then to help them get over, and we can pull from that and use some of this now.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm running out of time, unfortunately, Damon, but how can people purchase your book right now?
Well, they can go to your various bookstores like Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, Buxton Books on King Street, and just about any major bookstore in South Carolina carries it. If you're not in South Carolina, you can go on the websites of Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Buxton Books, or Arcadia Press, which publishes the books. Just Google the book online, and you can find where to purchase it online if you're not in the state of South Carolina. And if you're in the state of South Carolina, just make a trip to your friendly neighborhood bookstore, and I can guarantee you it won't bore you.
Right. And Damon, what other Black folk tales and chronicles do you want to publish and actually share with the community next when it comes to South Carolina?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that because I'm already working on the sequel to this book because there was so much material that I gathered both here and Africa. And then I made a recent trip to Ghana where I found some really fascinating stuff about the giant of Ghana and Anansi the spider and all these other things that will be in my next book that will probably come out around 2027 or 2028. But in the meantime, folklore is such a lost art with so few people doing it these days that I really want people to get this, to encourage them and to show you how people made a way out of no way with nothing but their minds and their experiences and their ability to speak.
Hmm. Professor and author Damon Fordham, thank you for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Close Ups.
You're welcome, sir. Good to be back.
Thank you.